Welcome to Stories from the Village of Nothing Much. Like easy listening, but for fiction. I'm Kathryn Nicolai. I write and read all the stories you'll hear on the Village of Nothing Much. Audio engineering and sound design is by Bob Wittersheim. In our show notes, you'll find links to our ad-free premium version, our other shows, merch, and our new wind-down box, a quarterly sleep subscription box full of products I've handpicked to bring a little more joy and ease to your bedtime. I'm here to take you into a lovely little village where, yes, not much happens, but there is a lot to enjoy and be curious about. I'm a lifelong reader, and I love a good, twisty, suspenseful story. But sometimes I'd come to my book with an already worn-out heart and brain, and I just needed some gentle storytelling to recharge me. And I thought, if I felt that way, then maybe others did too. And hey, you're here now, so I'm glad we found each other. So these stories, they're meant to be therapeutic, enjoyable, grounding. We recommend them as an excellent accompaniment to a walk, or your commute, your chores, or a nice hot bath. Now, into the village we go. And just because I think it will feel good, let's take a deep breath in through your nose and sigh from your mouth. Again, breathe in and let it go. Good. Our stories today celebrate some of the joys of being outside in the changing weather of the summer. I wrote the first one, Wind and Wildflowers, a couple of years before the second two, which are meant to be heard together as a two-part series. But I realized they feel like they're actually happening at the same time. And since many of our storylines cross over one another, I suggest we think of these two narrators as neighbors, each enjoying the heat and then the cooling air and the rain from their porches. They might wave at each other when they head out to their mailboxes. If one has a bumper crop of summer squash, a basketful will appear at the other's door. In winter, when the days are short, they take comfort from the lighted window of the other. So let's visit them, first in Wind and Wildflowers. We'll hike the trail behind the house, listen for woodpeckers, and watch the grasses sway in the wind. Then, in Rain and Shine, we'll finish up some work in the garden, take a long hot shower, and eat dinner on the porch as the storm rolls in. Finally, in Hummingbird, after a good night's sleep, we'll step outside with a glass of iced coffee and meet the morning and any visitors coming to have breakfast from the flowers. Wind and Wildflowers. I was out getting myself lost in the trails, deep into the thickest woods, where the sunlight barely made it through the crowns of the trees, and the air was cool and smelled of pine needles and damp earth. That's where I was. Sometimes I ran over the trails, feeling a sudden burst of eager energy wanting to be expelled. I'd watch the blur of branches rushing past and feel my legs push the earth away behind me. And when I tired, I'd let my momentum ebb until I was back to a serene, meandering pace. If something caught my attention, I might stop for minutes to examine it, to notice the webbing in a leaf, or the tiny metallic sparkle in a rock on the path, or the ridges of tree roots. Tree roots seem like their own magical category of wonder in the woods, and when I stepped carefully around them in the path, I thought about how trees talk to one another under the ground. how they reach out through the network of their roots to send warnings and supply food. I'd read that older trees, mother trees, can send sugars to younger saplings to help them grow, and that when a tree has reached the end of its life, it often deposits all of its resources back into the web of roots for other trees to absorb. From the path, I could see, up higher on a ridge, a tree that had fallen in a storm and landed leaning against the crooked branches of its neighbor. Its roots were tipped up on an angle, that network, that wood-wide web exposed, but its branches were full of green, healthy leaves. It had been knocked around a bit, but was still growing, still thriving in its own way. I wondered if its neighbors had shared some resources after the storm to help it through the season. They seemed no worse off if they had. A sudden knocking high in the branches broke through my thoughts, and I looked up to see a woodpecker hammering away. He was a tall bird, over a foot high from his gripping toes to the red tuft of feathers on his head. I liked his confidence to so unabashedly break the quiet of the forest. He didn't mind who heard. He needed his lunch and was going to get it. So far, I had learned compassion from the trees and confidence from the birds. I kept walking. The trees were thinning out a bit around me. More of the bright summer light was working its way into the path, and the air was getting warmer. I could hear the buzz, chirp, and stridulations of insects as I broke out of the shelter of the trees and into a broad clearing with high grasses. I was at the crown of a smallish hill, and the tufted tops of the grass on either side of the path came almost to my shoulders. I'd been lost in the trees, and now I was here, lost in the lee. Among the stalks were thin-stemmed wildflowers, being eagerly visited by fuzzy bees, who were rolling their round bodies in pollen, then buzzing off to share it with another bloom down the way. Another system of mutual benefit. It seemed a lot of the world had been built on them. I put that remembrance in my pocket, along with the trees and birds to carry home for future examination. There were Queen Anne's lace, growing thickly through the field, and I remembered gathering them as a child, pushing my thumbnail through the stem in the absence of scissors, and bringing them in a ragged bouquet to my mother, who would kindly thank me for the gift and set them up in a vase on the kitchen table. Is there a better gift than flowers? In the years since, I haven't found one. The wind was picking up, and over the sound of the bees and the crickets, I could hear the rush of 1,000,000 leaves and blades of grass brushing together in the air around me. Standing in a strong wind has always felt to me like being plugged directly into my own personal charger. The air moved over me, cutting around my arms and legs, pushing my hair out of my eyes, and cooling the heat from the back of my neck. I felt like my shelves were being restocked with all the energy I could ever use, and looked back at the edge of the tree line and watched the wind flip through the leaves of the cottonwoods, turning them to show their silvery undersides. I'd had an argument with my grandmother when I was a child about the wind. We'd been sitting at her kitchen table with our empty lunch dishes and refilled glasses of iced tea in front of us, when the wind had picked up suddenly, as it just had here on the hill. I told her that I could see the wind, and she'd pointed out that what I was seeing was what the wind moved, but that the wind was invisible. No one could see it. I'd been insistent and argued back with her for a while, eventually giving up and feeling a bit bad for her. How sad, I'd thought, to not be able to see the wind. The air was getting cooler, and the light was changing. A storm was coming, and I was glad for it. From the edge of the hill, I could just make out the covered porch of my house. And I thought by the strength of the wind and the color of the sky that I likely had just enough time to make it home. I'd sit on the covered porch with a glass of tea to honor Grandma and a few scruffy wildflowers for Mom, and watch the line of rain come over the hill. I'd rock back and forth in the porch glider and listen as it hit the roof and drenched the gardens. I'd take deep breaths of that sweet summer rain smell that you only get treated to a few days of the year, and lean back against the cushion and close my eyes. Rain and shine. The air had been thick and humid all day, and I'd managed to spend most of it in the garden, weeding and thinning out my vegetable patch. I was pruning my tomato plants this year, a technique I'd learned from a few gardener friends, though it seemed there were as many proponents as detractors, and I realized with every snip that I was taking a risk. But that is gardening in general. It is a reckoning of how little you can control, how much is out of your hands, and planting seeds anyway, with the hope that some will grow. Along with my tomatoes, the beans were climbing up the strings I'd tacked into place on the border fence, and the rows of lettuce were full and ready to pick. There were flowers on the zucchini and summer squash plants, and one tiny butternut squash that I was crossing my fingers over, hoping that the deer wouldn't eat it before I could. It wasn't a big garden. I'd learned that lesson the year before. I wanted to enjoy my time in it, and when I made it too big, it became all work and no play, so this year it was just a few rows. What I couldn't grow, I could buy from the other excellent gardeners around me. I didn't have to do everything myself. After my time working in the sun, I was pleasantly exhausted and headed in to peel off my soil-scuffed clothes and start the shower. I'd bought a big bunch of fresh eucalyptus from the market the day before, and I hung it by its twine tie from the shower head. As the water steamed, the room filled with the scent. I stepped in and took a minute just to enjoy the feeling of the water on my skin. The eucalyptus opened up my sinuses, and I closed my eyes and took deep breaths of it. Sometimes I felt too tired for a shower, but once I stepped in, I always felt better. I reached for my washcloth and started to lather up each part of myself. Face, hair, body, till I was squeaky clean and refreshed. I drew shapes on the fogged-up shower door and hummed and stared into space till I felt done and was ready to step out. When I was wrapped in fresh towels, I stepped over to the window. The light had changed, and I pushed the curtain aside to look into the yard. The bright sun was hidden by a thick layer of clouds, and when I lifted the sash, I could feel the humidity and heat had gone. A storm was coming. I was suddenly giddy for it, knowing it would be just what my garden needed and would cool the house off for a good night's sleep. I dressed in my pajamas and combed out my hair and took a moment to spread cream on my face and hands, then went from room to crack the windows. I kept the lights off where I didn't need them, enjoying the gloom after so much bright sun, and made my way to the kitchen. Earlier, I'd soaked a big bowl of bulgur for tabbouleh. It was the perfect summer salad for hot days, as the grains could be made without turning on the stove, and it was fresh and crunchy and just needed a few ingredients. I chopped cucumbers and tomatoes and scallions, then ran my knife through a bunch of parsley and a handful of fresh mint leaves and tossed it with the bulgur in the bowl. I squeezed lemon juice and drizzled olive oil and sprinkled salt and pepper, tasting as I went until it was tart and delicious. I spooned up a big portion onto a plate I sprinkled walnuts and pumpkin seeds on top just because that sounded good, and carried it with a glass of iced tea out onto my screened-in porch. The rain was minutes away, and I set myself up in a comfortable chair to wait for it, chewing slowly and watching the light change. There was a sudden gust of much cooler air, and then a sprinkle, and then the rain fell in drenching currents all around me. The sound it made on the roof, at first a pattering tattoo, grew to a rushing wash like a wave cresting on all sides. I set my plate aside and stretched out in the chair and closed my eyes and just listened to the rain. Through the screens, I could smell the water breaking into the soil, that fresh mineral scent, and imagined heading out to the garden tomorrow in mud boots. I thought of the way the water would pool in low places, how the rabbits would find spots to drink that hadn't been there the day before. In the field down the slope on the far edge of my yard was a marshy spot among the trees that flooded easily, even after short showers, and ducks would be bathing in it by morning. Flipping over in the water, splashing it under their wings, and shuffling them back together on their backs. The temperature had dropped speedily as the rain fell. It was at least 10 degrees cooler than it had been when I stepped out onto the porch. I relished the feeling of being just a little chilled and took a throw from the arm of the chair and tossed it over my legs. As quickly as it had come, the rain moved on. I picked up my plate again and ate a few bites, wondering if the sun would poke back out. I hoped it wouldn't. The break from the heat felt wonderful, and I knew if the clouds moved out, the temperature would shoot right back up. It might even be stickier than it was before, with all the fallen rain sitting on leaves and blades of grass, waiting to be absorbed back into the air. I had an old-fashioned barometer that I'd found at a tag sale, hung on the wall behind me. I remembered that it was more than a pretty piece of walnut and polished glass case. So I got up to look at it, squinting at the dial, and saw that its needle was spun well away from the fair weather mark and had dropped below rain to where stormy was painted in large copper plate letters. A moment later, I saw a flash out of the corner of my eye and waited for the thunder to clap. When it did, and the rain began lashing down again, it seemed like my cue to carry my things and myself back in and enjoy the rest of the storm from the window seat by the kitchen table. I knew that when I tucked myself into bed and felt the cool sheets against my skin with a hard day's work behind me and a night of rain and thunder ahead of me, I would fall right to sleep. Hummingbird. The morning after the rainstorm was fresh and quiet. I laid in bed, sometimes dozing back into sleep, trying to step back into a particularly nice dream, while the light slowly shifted around me. I'd left the windows cracked as much as I could overnight, and the air was still cool and pure-smelling, as if its very molecules had been washed, which I guess they sort of had. The birds seemed slow to wake, and I imagined them tucked in the nooks of trees, in their nests in my shrubs and in the houses hanging from the branches of the elm tree in the yard. When the sun was fully risen, they started to sing, to see that the storm was over and another day was starting. It seemed a good time for me to follow suit, and I pulled back the blankets and set my feet on the floor. I thought of that saying about getting up on the right side of the bed, and took a second before I stood just to think of something good from the previous 24 hours. Doing this almost always helped me get in a good frame of mind. And I found, once I started looking for one thing, I found another and another. It was like priming a pump. I'd see more things to smile at all day. I thought of sitting on my screened-in porch the night before as the rain began to pour down around me. How the sound of it had driven all thoughts from my head, all worries from my heart. How my garden would be happy for the deep drink of water, and the leftover tabbouleh in my fridge that would taste even better after a night of flavor mingling. See, I'd tried for one good thing, and before I even knew it, I'd found 3. I stood and took a deep breath, stretched my arms up over my head. I laced my fingers together, flipped my palms inside out. It felt so good just to move a little after that deep sleep that I just stretched any which way for a few minutes. Down in the kitchen, I pushed the window over the sink up till the morning air rolled in. I could feel that it would be another warm day. Iced coffee would really hit the spot. I took a large mason jar from the cupboard and added a good scoop of ice to it. I took a pitcher of cold brew from the fridge, along with a carton of oat milk. I like to watch the milk cut through the dark coffee, marbling the liquid like fog dispersing in warm air. I'd tried making my own coffee syrup from a recipe a friend had given me a while back, and found out how easy and delicious it was. I now had a little collection of bottles on my shelf, and I considered which one to reach for. I'd made the classics, hazelnut and cinnamon and brown sugar and almond, but had also tried rose and cardamom and, perfect for today, lavender. It had a light, floral, sweet flavor, and I added just a few drops to my drink and stirred it all with a long-handled iced teaspoon. I carried it out to the porch and pushed open the screen door. The sun had already dried up the rain on the stone steps, and I sat down on the second one from the top. I took a long drink of my coffee and smiled at how delicious it was. A movement caught my eye, and I spotted a hummingbird hovering near the helenium flowers just a few feet away. If you have never seen a hummingbird move, you might call it flying, but that doesn't do it justice. They seem to stop time, the way they drop through the air. They look too fascinating to be real, like a bit of animation that's been inserted into the mundane world. He had a bright red spot on his throat, and his green feathers shimmered like the iridescent wings of a dragonfly. I sat stock still, wanting the moment to go on as long as may be, and it seemed like he was doing the same, just sitting still in the air, though of course his wings were beating more than a dozen times each second. I wondered what he thought of me, if he thought anything at all, and if he would like my homemade lavender syrup, being a connoisseur of sweet, flowery flavors. He dipped his long, thin beak toward a flower, and I remembered that the common name for Helenium autumnale was sneezeweed. It was like an irresistible suggestion, like watching someone yawn, and though I tried to fight it, I let out a loud, sudden sternutation. I laughed at myself as the hummingbird flew off to find breakfast and peace somewhere else. I stayed on the porch steps, finishing my coffee and watching the dewy grass scintillate in the sun. I made toast in the kitchen while I thought about what I wanted my morning to look like. The garden would be pretty muddy for a while after last night's deluge. I could certainly see myself spending some time here in the kitchen, making a batch of pumpkin seed muffins or a tray of granola. But I thought that before I did anything else, I wanted to be outside and move my body. I considered doing some sun salutations on my porch, but I realized what I really wanted was a good long walk. Someone had said to me years before that the best kind of exercise is the kind that you like to do. And that had made a lot of sense to me. So while movement was a pretty consistent part of my days, I didn't stick to just one kind. And today I wanted to walk, maybe even to run, or certainly perambulate. I spread my toast with a thick layer of peanut butter and strawberry jam and crunched through it at my kitchen table. Then set the dish in the sink and went to get dressed. I'd walk down my long drive and out to the road, and from there I'd turn toward the lake. The crickets would be loud in the high grass on either side, and at the water I'd stop on a bench and watch for herons. I thought of myself in bed this morning, sleepily trying to retreat back into my dream. But why? There were so many good things to notice every day. Thank you for visiting me here in the village of Nothing Much. We'll be back again soon with more stories to soothe your system and boost your spirit. Be gentle with yourself.